transitioning over. And yes, Duke of Falls. Yes, well, yeah, I like the aspects of the slideshow because I actually did have took a lot of photographs of like skies and then cloud porn and that sort of thing. And so they know it's just like bad George Lloyd, but it's on. And so I also like made the tags as well to say, hey, I'm on Twitter. Hey, I have a Medium article up there. Hey, I have a Patreon. Hey, I'm probably going to revamp the Patreon in a bit. I'll think about it. But yes, I do. And that should work of like a Google Docs of like the hats that I have. Yes, I have a variety of different like hats. So if you donate at least $1, maybe I can change it to like if you cheer for like 100 bits or like a cheer for 50 bits or 25 bits or something like that. Make it reasonably cheap or inexpensive. Then yes, you can get me to like wear one of those like different hats that I own. I have a collection of hats and they're just right in like arm's reach, as it were. And I think I have this one on my hats document too, because it's the Australian hat that I have. But anyway, now we're into like part 3 of this like section. Chapter 5, Direct Action An Ethnography by David Graeber, may he rest in power, of like violence and not violence. We already got through the definition or the explanation of what is direct action and what is anarchism, and now violence versus non-violence. And I have my hot water leaf juice drink in now, and so we're going to continue. Part 3: Non-violence, violence and non-violence. The question of violence and nonviolence and property damage has haunted anarchism for at least the 19th century. There are obviously reasons why it should be a problem. On the one hand, there are any number of reasons why anarchists might be suspicious of violence. For one thing, anarchists start from the principles that one modes of the resistance should embody the world's wishes to create. Almost no one wishes to create a more violent world. Anarchists try to organize on non-hierarchical lines and argue that this is not only more than just more effective, but more effective, efficient. Violence, particularly aggressive violence, is one of the few forms of human activity that does to be more efficient if organized on a top-down command basis. This and the concomitant need of secrecy ensures that the more one prepares for war or something like that, the more difficult it is to organize democratically. On the other hand, anarchism wishes to see a social revolution, and it's hard to imagine how that could happen without any violent conflict whatsoever. Moreover, there's always insist on a moral sovereignty of individuals and tend to be very comfortable with the code's conduct. And in principle, it should be for each who's resistant to decide what is legitimate act of resistance to an intrinsic illegitimate power. Now, it's important not to overstate things here. In practice, a tangent agreement to do always exist. See a C's principle of diversity of tactics, about which we have heard so much in the earlier chapters, might have sounded like anything goes to pacifism like anti-globalization, but it was premised on shared understanding that no one was about to show up with firearms or explosives. They did show up with the catapult, though. But that got one of the participants like arrested. I think that was just the charge they come up with. They decided to like charge him with unlawful possession of a catapult or use of it. That would have been like simply unthinkable. If my experience is anything to go by, if anyone has ever suggested doing so, they would immediately have been assumed to be police infiltrators for that very reason. Oh, hey, this new anarchist organization. Hi, I'm John, not a cop. Would any of you like to do some crimes? Yeah. Nonetheless, and actually, a side note, even like in modern day today, in certain places in the imperialist corporations of white supremacy, like rural places, IWW has to like actually do secretive meetings in order to like recruit to like vet like new recruits or new members, as it were, because of they are seen as like a troublemaker and kind of like organization, so they kind of have to like go almost thieves guild like and have to like meet in secret in order to like find to vet new members, as it were, because they have to be covert about it in certain places. Anyway, nonetheless, such tangent understandings exist only amongst activists. If outsiders join in, one could never be quite sure what they're going to do. In Quebec, for instance, there was a scary story going around on the Black Bloc at one point during the actions that French gangbangers were going to show up at the wall with firearms, at which they assumed would be automatically blamed on them. In Seattle, the Black Bloc's carefully targeted destruction of corporate targets was, in a few cases, followed by episodes of opportunistic looting by local African American teenagers. In that case, it's unlikely any in the bloc object. To see oppressed communities rise up and join you is, in a way, the whole point. And as in John Panista's, that oppressed community standards of acceptable tactics might well be different than your own. However, for most of the most large mobilization, including Quebec City, also sees, at least in a few minor episodes, of what I call the drunken frat boy problem. Opportunistic violence, mainly for the fun of it, on the part of young people whose politics are likely to have nothing to do with the activists, or even be explicitly right-wing. And there's also, as with the police infiltrators, there's also like actual like people just like agitating things to like break windows of like a place and loot it and have it be blamed on the BLM protesters, for example. Certainly, there's been like a few cases like that, but also been a few cases that they were just like right-wing agitators, or that there were police trying to like get the blame on the BLM people, or get an excuse for like the other cops to arrest people. In Europe, this can also be like encouraged by police providing an excuse for repressive measures. Yeah, as I just said. The most extreme example of this came in Genova, when police apparently let it be known that they would turn a blind eye to this sort of thing. Fascists and soccer hooligans from all over Europe descended on the place, like I said before. And in recent events, in the past summer, Proud Boys showed up in places, and the police just let the Proud Boys do what they want, sadly. Because I know, and like in Seattle and other places like Portland, the members of the local Proud Boys in those chapters are also members of the police departments. So yeah, and speaking of like the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or the Capitol Hill protests, Chaz Choff, yeah, Proud Boys were terrorizing in that area in the weeks leading up to its collapse or its demise. The Seattle Police Department sent in a whole bunch of cops to like tear up the area. People had to like flee or else they get arrested. Anyway, so Genova. Yes, some of those who join forces are the same, the burned crosses. Genova was extreme, and this is usually a fairly minor problem. The whole moral dilemma for anarchists tends to come when isolated individuals claiming anarchist inspirations do something generally violent. And again, the anarchists who assassinated heads of states around the turn of the last century are probably the most dramatic examples. Like the assassination of President McKinley. The fascinating thing about in such cases is that the majority of such assassinations were conducted by isolated individuals, not people active in actual anarchist organizations. Many had only the vaguest ideas of what anarchist principles were. However, if one takes the principle of moral autonomy seriously, it's difficult to treat such acts as completely illegitimate. For our anarchist perspective, insofar as it is legitimate to engage in any sort of interpersonal violence, heads of states, major or capitalists, or high officials are clearly the most legitimate targets. Ah, yeah, I remember hearing about that. Yeah, I think Tristan Johnson of Setback History mentioned the McKinley assassination in his video of Emma Goldman. That was a great video, actually, because Emma Goldman, she is badass as hell. But Tristan Johnson also did a video, a Setback History issue on the McKinley assassination as well. And I think that's what they were mistaken in the guy for being a police informant as well, but he just like had difficulty communicating his intention, communicating with people. Yeah. Yeah, I've been meaning to like see that video of the McKinley assassination. Many had on. Let's see. However, yeah, okay. Yeah, assigned initials are most legitimate. To instead adopt a more conventional guerrilla war strategy from a small army and attack police stations or army posts, thus trying to kill a bunch of ordinary people who are in no sense directly responsible for the police policies one object to, would clearly be far more problematic. Actually, it's hard to deny that. By any moral standards, assassination is far superior to war. In a video game, on the other hand, since heads of states tend to find this kind of logic highly objectable, the results are invariably disastrous. Writers like Peter Kropotkin or Adam Goldman, mainly concerned with disseminating his anarchist ideas before a broader public, often struggle painfully with what to do or say about such people. Is it legitimate to condone them? What sort of like solidarity does one owe them? Does one not at least have the responsibility to explain to the world that there are points of view? Debates over broken windows and property damage, or the possibilities of Molotovs in Quebec City, we call them freedom potions, are simply more recent versions of the same thing. And activists who have been on the scene only as long as the 2 or 3 years tend to complain about the need to constantly reinvent the wheel in such manners. Every time there's a major action, everyone has to go through exactly the same debates. Some will argue that confrontation tactics or property damage will only make activists look bad in the eyes of the public. Others will argue that the corporate media wouldn't make us look good at whatever we do. That's what I would argue, honestly. Someone argued that if you smash a Starbucks window, that will be the only story on the news, effectively freezing any consideration of issues. Others will rely that, if there's no property damage, there won't be any story at all. It's a give or take another thing. I'm in the opinion that the mainstream media is never going to accurately and tell your story, side of the story, even if you give street interviews like what was discussed on my previous stream on Thursday. Even if you do, even like David Graeber did when he was actually interviewed in Quebec City in the diary portion of it, when he did a street interview, he reflected and I was like, man, I must have sounded like a delusional idiot. But that's because he was also severe tear gas as part of the demonstration, as it were, and so and that probably led him to be like that sort of thing. But as Von Reck said in the chat as well, that they will edit those interviews as well to make it seem like you're more confrontational, more violent than you seem. Anyway, some will claim confrontational tactics deprive activists of the moral high ground. Others will excuse those people of being elitists, and insist that the violence of the system is so overwhelming that to refuse to confront it efficiently is itself acquiescence to violence. That's actually kind of my stance. I just whenever I say I'm for a revolution, and liberals will balk at that or say and whatever, or invoke the terror from the French Revolution, I would go, well, what about the violence that the state inflicts on its people through poverty and enforcement of poverty, as it were? And that's where I see it. You mean a man just after being tear gassed will look less put together than per expert heard in a suit, in an air-conditioned room, and of an interview or advance and arranged in weeks in advance? Yeah, exactly. Some would argue that militant tactics endangered nonviolent protesters. Others will insist that unless one creates some sort of like peace police to physically threaten anyone who sprays paints or breaks windows, someone would probably do so. And if so, coordinating with the militants rather than isolating them is much safer for all concerned. Yep, gotta manufacture that consent. Very true. I have that. I have that book. I should really read that. In the end, one almost invariably ends up with the same revolution that as long as no one is actually attacking another human being, the important thing is to maintain solidarity. The last thing you want to end up is in a situation like Seattle, where you actually had pacifists physically assaulting anarchists trying to break windows or turning them into the police. Yeah. Many remarked that the conclusion is so inevitable that one wishes that it is possible to simply fast forward to the debate. But as many will resignedly remark, it seems that each time a major action rolls along, those newly brought into the movement have worked all these things out for themselves. One result, though, is a kind of constant paradox within anarchism. It's not that like one cannot find passive like active anarchists. Quite a number of pacifists do see themselves as anarchists. Those contemporary anarchists who are not pacifists, however, tend to avoid any association with pacifism, and in fact are likely to react to the mention of the word in vigorous condemnation, despite the fact that in the largest perspectives, there's ideas and practices emerge from much more from the tradition than from any others. One would be hard-pressed to find an anarchist who insists would not be place himself more on the side of Malcolm X, whose instinct would not be place himself more on the side of Malcolm X than with Martin Luther King or Gandhi. However, the fact remains that in terms of overall approach, Gandhi's "become the change you want to see" seems 1,000 times more in keeping with the anarchist spirit than Malcolm X "by all means necessary." And Gandhi himself recognizes a strong philosophical affinity of his own ideas with anarchism, which Malcolm X did not. By all means necessary, in fact, seems a lot like the very ends justify the means logic which anarchism has constantly rejected. Yet, practical annoyance with pacifists, combined with the inevitable instinct to identify with the most radical option, tends to ensure that almost invariably the anarchist will nevertheless identify himself with Malcolm X. Mm-hmm. I think Peter Gerdelus mentions in like how nonviolence protects the states of how the peaceful actions of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. seemed to be successful, but only because they were like in the forefront, covered by the news media. While in the backdrop, there was I forgot the Indian activist that like was part of that like an Indian independence that Gandhi also participated in, but like no one barely knows his name. Well, people do know Malcolm X, but like I think part of like Martin Luther King Jr. was successful in getting the Civil Rights Act passed by Lyndon B. Johnson is because there was like the Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and the Fred Hamptons who were the more violent a part of that movement, and if Lyndon B. Johnson didn't deal with like a Martin Luther King Jr., they had to deal with Malcolm X. The same thing with Gandhi. If the British Empire didn't have to deal with Gandhi, then they don't have to deal with the more violent wings of it. So even though like people who advocate for like peaceful protests, as it were, it's you need more violent acts of it to at least pressure them into like making concessions, or at least pressure them into like giving into our demands. That's where in a video game. Nonviolence to Protect the States is a really good book that I need to read. I've listened to the audiobook of it on Audible Anarchist. It's a good listen. Anyway, most anarchists nowadays, for example, are fond of citing arguments in like Oh yeah, Bahit Singh. Yeah, thank you, Duke of Halls. Yeah, that's who I was thinking of. Yeah. Yeah, in the first chapter, in the introduction to how nonviolence protects the states, that was like Peter Gelderloos's arguments. Bahat Singh did a lot in the background, but because he was like a more, yeah, it would be a Sikh too. Yeah, yeah. I know some Sikh people actually. I never like ask them about their religion though, but yeah. Um, Most anarchists nowadays, for example, are fond of citing arguments like Native American activist Ward Churchill's pacifism as pathology in 1988. That pacifism itself is mainly a way for white liberals to feel good about themselves that generally oppressed groups did not have the luxuries, and that apparent exceptions, the victories of Gandhi or King, were really only made possible by their opponents' fears of more violent alternatives. The leaders of the Canadian National Socialist Party of the DNP is Sikh. He's pretty cool. I heard about him actually. I listened. I have a friend named Corey Johnson who does a political podcast with a friend of his. From Many People's Strengths, I think, and because Corey Johnson and his other friend is from the province of Saskatchewan, and so they talked about like the actual Canadian politics, a bit of electoralism, but still, and Corey Johnson is anarcho-communism himself. And so I heard about like the NDP and like the leader in the NDP, whose name is escaping me right now, but actually but it seems like David Graeber is like reaffirming what I was like saying before. Jasmine Singh, yeah, thank you, Duke of Falls, yeah, that's who I was thinking. But yeah, the genuine oppressing groups don't have such luxuries. That apparent exceptions, the victories of Gandhi and King, were only made possible by their opponents' fears of more violent alternatives. The fact that authors like Churchill also tend to reject anarchists like critiques of hierarchies in favor of militarist-style leaderships tend to go unremarked or written off as essential. No, I want to click. Wait, does that thing not work? See if this one works. Okay, because number 22 was not working for some reason. At least the authors remember Wade Churchill doing and so when questioned by anarchists in a forum in 2002. Others, notably my editor Charles, tell me he has since moderated his views on such matters. So now we're going back. The fact that Churchill is Native American, however, is significant. In fact, very few North American anarchists would themselves go far beyond breaking a window. Almost all scrupulously avoid harming others in any way. As I occasionally point out to journalists, it is not to find a constant reference to Black Bloc. Anarchists as violence, assuming when one has spent any time with them and disturbed them, for instance, carefully avoid stepping on worms or debating about whether it is really justified to kill a mosquito. The real point of fractures comes in precisely when it comes to issues of solidarity. To take a constant nonviolent position, one would have to, for example, tell the Zapatistas in Gesta that they shouldn't really have conducted a armed insurrection, however brief, or that the Black Panthers that's a bunch of middle-class white anarchists had more authority to tell them what sort of tactics to employ than they did. The Black Panthers are actually pretty awesome. And I have more hot water leaf juice. Green tea this time. This dichotomy between community building, in which anarchists have everything in common with pacifists, and solidarity with oppressed groups, is a constant dilemma that will come up throughout this book. It is interesting to observe that historically, anarchism has thrived as revolutionary movements most of all time of peace, and is largely demilitarized societies. As Edward as Eric Hobsbawm has noted, 1973, 61, page 61, during the latter years of the 19th century, when most Marxist parties were rapidly becoming reformist social democrats, it was anarchists that stood at the center of the revolutionary left. I think I heard about this. In 1905 to 1914, the Marxist left had, in most countries, been on the fringe of revolutionary movements. The main body of Marxists have been identified with the de facto non-revolutionary social democracy, while the bulk of the revolutionary left was anarcho-syndicalist, or at least much closer to the ideas of the mood of anarcho-syndicalism than to that of the classic Marxism. That's the actual quote from the book that David Graeber was referring to. Things really only changed when World War I, and of course after the Russian Revolution. The conventional historiography assumes that it was the creation of the Soviet Union that led to the decline of anarchism and catapulted communism everywhere to the fore. Still, it seems to me that one could look at this in another way. In the late 19th century, most people honestly believed that war between industrial powers was becoming obsolete. By 1900, even the use of passports was considered an antiquated barbarism. While colonial adventures were always a constant war between, say, England and France, seems about as unthinkable as it would today. The short 20th century, which appears to have begun in 1914 and ended somewhere around 1989 or 1991, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the USSR, was by constant probably the most violent in human history. That century. It was a century in which major powers were continuously preoccupied with either waging world wars or preparing for them. Hardly surprising, then, that anarchism might seem unrealistic. The creation of maintenance of huge mechanized killing machines does seem to be one thing that anarchists can never, by definition, be very good at. I say this largely to our credit. Neither is it surprising that Marxist parties, already organized on a command structure, from whom the organizations of huge mechanized killing machines are often proved about the only thing that they are particularly good at. I think this is a jab at the USSR and then China and other and Pol Pot and Cambodia and other regimes like that. Begin to seem immediately practical and realistic in comparison. Yeah, people don't feel good about making massive death machines if they can, if really choose not to. Exactly. It makes perfect sense, then, that the moment that the Cold War ended and violent conflict between industrialized powers again came to seem unthinkable, anarchism popped right back into where it has been at the end of the 19th century, a national movement at the very center of the revolutionary left. The surprising thing was that it happened almost instantly. What's more, one could make a case that the effectiveness of more militant anarchism tactics tend to depend on the effective demilitarization of society. Consider here the battles over squats in Italy or Germany, or even battles surrounding the expansion of the National Airport in Japan, in which anarchists or local equivalents were able to fight pitched battles with police, defend territories with clubs and stones and against tear gas and water cannons, and as often as not, were actually allowed to win. Anarchism is like mushrooms. We are mycelium under the surface, waiting to sprout out our mushrooms on the surface when and where we can. It is hard to think of anything remotely like this happening in the United States. In America, the police simply will not allow themselves to lose. We're kind of seeing that now, actually, with the constant protests in Portland and other places. If they decide to move on squat in force, the squat will lose. Yeah, this happened last year, in October in 2019. The Moms for Housings, the there's a group of moms with their families and their children that squatted a house that was just not being used by the Wentworth real estate company, and because the Wentworth company, a real estate investment company, bought that house in 2008 with the crash for really cheap and been holding it, have it remain empty for years, is just so that when the housing market is right, they can just renovate that house and sell for huge profits. Their investment company, that's the whole thing, and to make profits for their investors. And so a bunch of moms for housing just squat that in the home, and the local government, the state government, and the police send in robots used to sniff out bombs, and got a tank and a Humvee, and lots of police officers are swatting officers with AR-15s to evict those moms that were just squatting there, moms for housing. And Democracy Now! That actually covered that, and it was and the moms did not resist at all. They just want to do it non-violently. They have the children there, and so yeah, they just did not resist at all. But the police treated them as if they were a guerrilla tactics insurgents threat, when they were just moms who were homeless that needed a home. Mothers are dangerous. Gotta send the robots. The only reason to defend it is to make the police job so difficult that they will hesitate before attacking any squats in future. That doesn't happen in Oakland. It's not just because American society is far more heavily policed. It is also because Italy, Germany, and Japan are all significantly former Axis powers and have been so effectively demilitarized. Startup battles with police are only possible in societies in which everyone, including the public, is aware that almost no one owns firearms, and therefore police tactics appropriate to society where most criminals can be assumed to be heavily armed, for example SWAT teams, seem widely inappropriate, and certainly in those parts of Europe where firearms and military know-how is much more broadly available. One thinks of Russia, Albania, the former Yugoslavia, or for that matter Iraq. Classic anarchism and anarchist tactics do not find nearly as fertile ground. Curiously, the real inspiration for the kind of tactics employed in the current wave of globalization protests came from the movements in parts of the global south which had not, until recently, really been able to engage in nonviolent direct action at all. People's Global Action. Oh, so that was PGA stand for in the previous chapters. I forgot what it stands for and I couldn't figure it out. So People's Global Actions, which put out the call for Seattle, was founded on the initiative of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, EZALN, in Chasta. The Zapatista movement it seems to me, can be best seen as an attempt by people who have historically been denied the right to nonviolent civil resistance to seize it. Essentially, to call the bluff of neoliberalism and its pretense to democratized nation yielding power to civil society. It is, as this commander says, a army that inspires not to be a army anymore. Since their initial 3-week insurgents in January 1994, it has become about the least violent army imaginable. It's something of an open secret that for the last 5 years at least, they have not even been carrying real guns. The CLN is sort of like an army that organized invasions of Mexico's military bases in which hundreds of rebels sweep in entirely unarmed to scream at and try to shame the resident soldiers. The other two Keys founders the members of the PGA were the KRRS, a Ghanaian peasant movement in India, and the MST, or Landless Peasants Movement in Brazil. The latter has gained an enormous moral authority in Brazil by nonviolent mass actions aimed at reoccupying unused lands, entirely nonviolently. As with the Zapatistas, it's pretty clear that if the same people had tried the same thing 20 years ago, they would simply have been mowed down. The most radical movements in South America today, in fact, tends to be as nonviolent as they can get away with. Most will, like the militants in Quebec City, limit themselves to throwing rocks and now normally against fully armed riot police, but would never dream of using firearms. The situation is complicated because in many parts of Latin America there is and has been a much richer tradition of nonviolent direct action in either Europe or North America, but the globalization movement immediately inspired seems to come primarily from groups that 20 or 30 years ago would almost entirely have been forced to resort to guerrilla warfare, but who has watched so many earlier guerrilla movements destroy themselves, or degenerate into nihilist gangsters, have chosen instead to take a radical different approach. In moving away from military tactics, they have often also ended up, often rather despite themselves, moving towards much more anarchist forms of organization. And now, part 4, an extremely brief history of relations between direct action and direct democracy in the U.S. since the 1960s. Ooh, this will be a good part. Before World War II, the main locus of direct action in North America, I think that's supposed to be focus. Yep. Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. In North America, yeah, I gotta remember that too. I gotta sit up straight against the chair, but I so continuously slouch. You heard that, unfortunately, so I'll bring my mic closer to the position I should be sitting at, and so probably will encourage me to sit more upright, as it were. The period since the war has seen a gradual merger of traditional direct action and direct democracy, and with the two only really coming together in the late 70s and the early 80s, ready to be revived by the influence of the Zapatistas. The story is very complicated, but a caricature version might run something like this. The 1960s, the New Left kicked off with a call for participating direct democracy in the famous Port Hudson Statement of the 1962, founding document of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. In principle, author Tom Hunting was inspired ultimately by John Dewar and C. Wright Mills, and the document was notable for calling for a broad democratization of all aspects of American society to create a situation where people are making for themselves the decisions that affect their lives. And let's go to note number 24. Hayden's more immediate inspiration was his former philosophy teacher, Aaron Kaufman, at University of Michigan. Nice. One might see that this very anarchist vision of the SDS at its inception had a very different orientation. Actually, their original political program was to radicalize the Democratic Party. They only abandoned it when it's placed in the impossible position by the Democrats in continued pursuit of the Vietnam War. Even more critically, those who framed the statement seems to have only the sketchiest ideas of what participatory democracy might mean in practice. This is most evident in the contradictional character of the SDS owns structure. As Francois Paulitz, 2002, has pointed out, SDS was on paper quite a formal top-down organization, with a centralized steering committee and meetings run accordingly to Robert's Rules of Order. In practice, it was made up of largely autonomous cells that operated by a kind of crude de facto consensus process. The emphasis on consensus, in turn, appears to have been inspired by examples of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the student wing of the civil rights movements. The SNCC has originally been created on the initiative of Antia Baker and a number of other activists who has been involved in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who were hoping to create an alternative to the CLC, its top-down structure and charismatic leadership, embodied, of course, in the figure of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Famous for organizing lunch table sit-ins, freedom rides, and other direct actions, SNCC was organized on the thoroughly decentralized basis, with ideas for new projects expressed to emerge from individual chapters, all of which operated by a kind of rough-and-ready consensus. It seemed pretty base. This emphasis on consensus is a bit surprising, since at the time there was a very little model for it. In both SNCC and SDS, it appears to have emerged from a feeling that since no one should be expected to do anything against their will, decisions should really be anonymous. However, there doesn't seem to have been anything like what's now called consensus process in the formal sense of the term. The problem was that there was no obvious model. The only communication in North America with a living tradition of consensus decision-making, the Quakers and various Native American groups, were either unknown, unavailable, or uninterested in proselytizing. Yeah. And yeah, honestly, it's like with so many people not realizing that no, the communism has worked a lot of the times, but they just don't like look into like Native American groups or the Quakers' has worked. They just don't study it. It's not taught in schools. Quakers at the time tended to see consensus essentially as religious practice. They were, according to Poletta, 2002, on page 195, actually very resistant to the idea of teaching it to anyone else. The New Left was, as we all know, essentially a campus movement. Paul Mantrick Jr., 1970, has argued that the wave of 1960s activism seems to have emerged from a kind of socialist bottleneck. That welfare state ideal of the time had been to diffuse class tensions by offering a specter of provincial society mobility in much the same way that the frontiers had once did. After the war, there was a very consensus effort on the part of the government to pump resources into higher education system, which began to expand exponentially, along with the numbers of working-class children attending universities. The problem was, of course, that such growth curves invariably hits their limits, and as any third-world government has attempted this strategy has learned, when they do, the results are typically explosive. And by the 1960s, this was starting to happen. Millions of students were left without any realistic prospects of finding jobs that bore any relations to their real expectations or capacities. We're kind of experiencing that now, actually. We've experienced that since like the 2008 crash. And it was kind of the lie we were fed to like just get a good job and then just get a good degree and then the good job will be available for you. But even now, whereas like a lot of the good jobs requires those degrees, there's no guarantee that those good jobs are there. And we were heading into recession before the COVID-19 thing, but even now with the COVID-19 thing, things are exacerbated. In fact, like one person just said, like, I don't know, I don't have a plan. I just plan to like go to college a lot and rack up a lot of student debt and figure out what to do from there. That's a plan, but anyway. or a normal prospect in industrial societies actually, but suddenly, hugely exacerbated. These were the students who first became involved in SDS. People who, as Marxist emphasizes, like their equivalents in the global South, always saw themselves as a kind of breakaway fragment of the administrative elites. This was, he suggested, crucial to understanding the limits of the New Left, that activists invariably saw themselves as organizers, social workers. Now let's see this note. Democratic studies, Franks in 1971, Madoff and Franks in 1971, tended to show that in the early years of the SDS, the movement was largely comprised of liberal arts students, the liberal art college students in elite universities from affluent left-leaning professional families, i.e., children of doctors, lawyers, teachers, rather than businessmen, and children of successful immigrant families rather than members of the old money elite. However, after SDS expanded in the late 1960s, the social base became much broader and began to include many students of working class backgrounds as well. As we'll see, this latter pattern is basically the one that always recurs in revolutionary movements, a convergence of alienated and rebellious children of the professional class with frustrated by upward mobile children of the working class with some experience of higher education. Interesting. I don't think that dynamic, that tension is going to go away anytime soon, or if it ever did. What unified all factions of the left was the conception of their relationships to actual or fantasized communities as organizers. After the example of trade unionists and social workers, rather than as fellow students or workers with a particular understanding of a situation shared with others and ideas of what to do about it, despite the disagreement over the primary target of organizing, unemployed, blue-collar workers, white-collar workers, dropout youths, in each case, the community was seen as a potential consensity, or in PL, Public Labor Party's language, base. The radicals saw themselves as professional revolutionaries, a force so to speak outside of society, organizing in those ideas on their own, perhaps. Thus, the activists played the part of reserve in library theory for the state, a point not to be neglected in the attempts to understand the drift of the new left from an orientation of liberal governance, reform to Lenin-Stalinism concepts of socialism. Beginning of 1970-22. Yeah, I can see how some tankies come out of that in Lenin's. The contradictions of this situation eventually become apparent as the decade rolled on. The crisis was sparked first in groups like SNCC, when demands for civil rights became to give way to calls for black power. The radicals in SNCC, who were eventually to found the Black Panthers, called on white activists to stop doing allegiance works and return to their own communities, particularly in order to organize white communities against racism. Okay, yeah. That makes sense. Which is why there wasn't any like white people who like founded the Black Panthers or worked with the founders of the Black Panthers at the time. They wanted just like, hey, listen, other white people will listen to you, other white people. So you work within those communities to fight against racism. We'll do our own thing. SES activists also greeted such calls with great ambivalence. Barbara, 2001. In part because they were never quite clear on what their own communities were supposed to be. One could say something along those lines have been attempted in the early 1960s with the Economic Research Areas Project, intended as the white equivalent to grassroots civil rights organizing that brought SDS activists into poor white communities. Interesting. And tried to mobilize communities around matters of common concern. Some of these projects scored victories in gaining local reforms, but organizers never felt much part of the communities in which they worked. felt isolated from other activists, and few saw the results as worth the sacrifice. The project fell apart in 1965. Instead, as Magnus keenly observed, many began to realize that if there was a way to overcome the alienation of dead-end jobs, to find work that actively lived up to their imagination capacities, it was in activism itself. Other activists and efforts were their communities. The crisis initiated by the Black powers ultimately led to in two very different directions. Again, at the cost of gross simplification. Once their allies in the civil rights movements have abandoned them, white activists were effectively left with two options. They could either try to build counterculture institutions of their own, or try to focus on allying with the communities or revolutionary groups in the struggle overseas, i.e. the Viet Cong or other third world revolutionaries. So would take pretty much whatever allies they could get. As SDS began to splinter into squabbling Maoist factions, group like Diggers and Yippies, founded in 1968, took the first option. Many were explicitly anarchists, and certainly the late 60s turned towards the creation of autonomous collectives, and institutional building was squarely within the anarchist traditions, while the emphasis on the free love, psychedelic drugs, and the creation of alternative forms of pleasure was squarely in the bohemian tradition, with the Euro-American anarchism has always been at least somewhat aligned. The Yippie slogan, "Revolution for the hell of it," could be seen as emerging directly from the realization that activism itself could become the prime means of overcoming alienation. The other options was to see oneself as primarily aligning with revolutionary communities overseas, hence the obsession with glorifying revolutionary heroes in Cuba, Vietnam, and China, and elsewhere. Men who, as situationists and autonomous critics have pointed out, were essentially icons of the sort of new radical administration elites with which the SDS had already tactically identified. So this is where the kind of like the Che Guevara t-shirts come about, as it were. I can see that, yeah. And the feeling one needs to strike back against the empire from within the belly of the beast. Each strategy invites a return to direct action, but simultaneously a jettison of the whole project of creating egalitarian decision-making structures. Hippies and yippies might be considered a bit ambivalent in this regard, as small communities, as small communes, and many alternative institutions created in this process generally did operate on democratic principles. Still, the yippies, with their wild, acid-inspired pranks and media stunts, tend to turn into a platform for charismatic inspirationals like Albeit Hoffman and Jerry Rubin in a style that proved notoriously alienating to some members of the white working class. The Weathermen, in turn, attempted a series of bombings directly at military and corporate targets, meant to inspire spontaneous emulation and drive societies towards a revolutionary confrontation, though when the significant limitation that they did not want to kill anyone, they ended up mainly blowing up empty buildings. Interesting, both had a profound effect on the latter media policy, since mainstream journalists began to feel complacent, coming to the conclusion that increasingly wild and destructive acts were in fact inspired by a need to constantly escalate in order to make headlines. It's interesting, yeah. I have heard persistent rumors from the 1960s veterans, for example, that the Weathermen's bombings campaign was far more extensive and devastating than has ever been recorded, but that there was a conscientious decision by the national media to stop reporting on it. That'd be interesting to research. I have no idea if this is true. Still, one thing that is clear is that since this period, American media has become, more than any other institution any other industrial democracy I'm aware of, extremely reluctant to report on activist stunts of any sort, or even demonstrations. Which is probably why when they do a report of like the WTO rights or something like that, they focus on like the window smashings, as it were. They one or two like sensational isolated incidents opposed to the movement as a whole, and why they never really kind of like get their the stories, as it were, or talk to them. This point would become important later on. For now, though, the key point is that none of these groups combined within their interests in direct actions were with emphasis on the decentralizing decision making. To the contrary, whether because the focus is on the other hand to charismatic figures who were at least potential media stars, or to the kind of cell-like a military structure able to carry out guerrilla-like attacks, the impulse was in the other direction. Moreover, both strategies flare up from a few years and very rapidly fade away, though the alternative institutions created around this time often lasted considerably longer. It has become a conventional habit in liberal scholarships to contrast the serious activism of the early 1960s, new left with the support childish extremism of the late 1960s and early 1970s. I do not want to leave the reader with the impression I agree with this. The standard liberal complaint is that the 1960s counterculture, in an effort, the first mass-based industrial bohemianism, destroyed itself in ultra-reactionary radicalism. Moreover, in doing so, the argument goes, it left an opening for right-wing activists to adopt many of the same grassroots organizing techniques developed by the SDS to reach out to the very white working-class constituents SDS had such a difficult time organizing, to mobilize them against the very counterculture. Interesting. Can't explain the 70s. There's certainly an irony here, but it seems to me it is better to see both periods as attempts to work through certain fundamental dilemmas that are still with us today. I myself suspect the real culprits in the rise of eventual hegemony of the new right is not the excess of the Maoists and yippies, but rather the fact that the America stopped using higher education as a means of class mobility. David Graeber talked about this. When people just have everything that they needed in order to live, and they just were free to like do what they want, but they formed the hippie communes, and they formed free love, and they did all this like LSD and did those drugs. And the institutions of America is like kind of look at that. The leadership of America is looking at it and go, let's not never do that again, and kind of walk back a lot of the like reforms that the New Deal brought us. As most of America's frustration administrative classes were absorbed in a new, more flexible capitalism, this was the kind of the start of neoliberalism in the 70s, the white working class. Yeah, drugs and communists are great, though. The white working class was increasingly locked out of any access to the means of cultural production, other than perhaps their church. The result was perhaps a predictable resentment against the supposed countercultural excess of liberal elite. Oh, we're still hearing about the liberal elites today. In fact, those constituencies that most reliably continue to vote Democratic are precisely those who have some hope of mobility through education. Immigrants, African Americans, even women who are at this point attending universities at far higher rates than men. This is certainly no parallel in communities of color to the explicit anti-intellectualism of so much of the radical right. Yep, the anti-intellectualism, we still have it today, even in the alt-right. The alt-right being Nazis, of course. By this as it may, the second period was far more complex and creative than critics are usually willing to let on. Many of the ideas that came out of it were extraordinarily persistent. Considering, for example, Huey Newman's The Notion of Intercommunity, which became the official Black Panther position in the 1971, and which held that the national state was in the process of breaking down as a main stage of political struggle, and that any effective revolutionary politics would have begun with a allegiance between local organized communities in retrospective of national borders. The real problem was how they self-organize. The Black Panthers, typified as by figures like Newman and himself, eventually came to embody the era in which macho, chauvinist leadership style themselves came to seem as synonymous with militarism. Now, it's probably significant that in SNCC, the first move towards rejecting decentralized decision-making was initiated by the emerging Black Power factions, Pollitt's 2002, carefully analyze of the organization's history of the movement shows quite clearly that the consensus of decentralization were not challenged because they weren't actually inefficient. Rather, they were used as a wedge issue. So they use wedge issues today. Gotta finish the tea soon, before it gets cold. By observing about democratic process, white activists in SNCC and their allies could be identified with endless talk and fussing about. The more militant Black Power factions could present itself as the ideal model of ruthless efficiency. Cold tea is anti-revolutionary, yes. Itself the ideal, unless it's IT. Yes, unless it's IT. Cold hot tea, that's for anti-revolutionary. It could present itself as the ideal model of ruthless efficiency appropriate to truly militant organizations. It is probable also significant that Nitoski's Kamanje, who became the main spokesman for the Black Panthers position, was fond of saying things like, the only position for a woman in SNCC is prone. Whoa! They're not all angels. The fact that even in the mid-1960s, such things could be said in an organization that was originally founded by a woman as a revolt against chauvinist male authority is itself astounding, not to say the least. But it might give a sense of the sexual politics always lying not far below the surface of the old New Left. Militant nationalism movements are, of course, notorious for providing platforms for the vigorous reassertions of types of masculine authority, but sentiments similar to Charlemagne's could be found coming from the mouths of white activists of the time as well. The feminist movement, in fact, became largely within the New Left as a reaction to precisely this sort of macho leadership style, or is simply among those who tried who's tired of discovering that even during universal occupation, they were still expected to provide sandwiches and provide free sexual services while male activists posed for the cameras. This is why the revolution must be intersectional or not at all. Oh, and I mean, some people, and we still carry a lot of leftists still carry some of this machismo attitudes. That's why the whole thing of brochless exists. The reveal of interest in creating particular forms of direct democracy, in turn, in fact, the real origins of the current movement, thus trace back less to these males in the 1960s, radical than the women's movement that arose largely in reaction to them. For example, Freeman 1971 and Edmonds in 1979. When the feminist movement began, it was organizationally very similar. Its basic units were small consensus-raising circles. The approach was informal, intimate, and anti-intellectual. Most of the first groups emerged directly from the New Left's circles. insofar as they placed themselves in relations to a previously radical tradition. It was usually anarchism. While the informal organizations proved extremely well suited for consensus raising as groups turned into planning actions and particularly as they grew larger, problems tended to develop. Almost inevitably, such groups came to dominate by an inner circle of women who were or had become close friends. The nature of the inner circle would vary, but somehow one would also always emerge. I think this is why some would always argue that there's always going to be people that have more, or there's always going to be leaders in the movement, as it were. I'm seeing the discussion actually right now where it's just well, there's always going to be bigger YouTubers, as it were, bigger brand tubers, as it were. That's just always going to happen. But I think it is worth considering to constantly fight against that. That even if everyone loves Terry Pratchett and would get an autograph from him when he was alive, as opposed to other authors and writers, that's still kind of a dynamic of someone who's more popular could have some kind of influence over the less popular authors. At least it's just something to consider. We probably will never get rid of that kind of the drive to always want to everyone having the same favorite author as Terry Pratchett or Neil Gaiman, but something to at least consider. Anyway, as a result, in some groups, lesbians ended up feeling excluded. In others, the same thing would happen to straight women. Other groups would grow rapidly in size and then see most of the newcomers quickly drop off again as there was no way to integrate them. Endless debates ensue. One result was an easy call, The Tyranny of the Structuralist-Ness, written by Mary Joan Freeman in 1970, first published in 1972, a text still avidly read by organizers of all sorts in the present day. Freeman's argument is fairly simple. No matter how sincere one's dedication to egalitarian principles, the fact is that any activist group different members will have different skills, abilities, experiences, personal qualities, and levels of dedication. As a result, some sort of elite or leadership structure will inevitably develop. In a lot of the ways, having an unacknowledgement leader structure, as she argued, could be a lot more damaging than having a formal one. At least, with a formal structure, it's possible to establish precisely what's expected of those who are doing the most important coordinated tasks and hold them accountable. I'm going to take a quick break right now because I need to use the facilities. So we're going to take a quick self-care break, but still good time to get up and stretch and move around. And I'm going to transition to the right back screen, and I'm going to be right back. It'll probably just be a minute or so or less. Alright, I am back. Transitioning back over. Hello. Hope everyone's enjoying themselves and everyone's having a good time. Where was I? Yeah, it's here. One reason for this essay's ongoing popularity is that it can be used as such a wide variety of positions. Liberals and socialists regularly cite the tyranny of the structuralist as a justification for why any sort of anarchist organization is bound to fail. I can see it being used like that. As a chatter for the return to older top-down styles of organizations, replete with executive officers, steering committees, and the like. Egalitarian objects that even to the extent that this is true, it is far worse to have a leadership that feels fully entitled to its power than one that has to take accusations of hypocrisy seriously. Yeah. Anarchists, therefore, have usually read Freeman's arguments as a call to formalizing group process to ensure greater equity, and in fact, most of her constructed suggestions clarify what tasks are assigned to what individuals, finding a way for groups to review those individuals' performances, disturbingly responsibilities as widely as possible, perhaps by rotation, ensuring and all have equally access to the information and resources. We're clearly meant to precisely end that. And that's how I see like an anarchist organization will work. It would be kind of a rotation process, almost like jury duties were. But like no one person is going to like have this leadership position or have this position for like years and years and years. They'll at least have to be like replaced by somebody. But that way it can like give other people the opportunity to like take that position and maybe strengthen their organization skills as or and the people skills, and then other people can like do other things, but also so that like there's no concentration of power. Within the larger feminist movement itself, most of these arguments eventually become moot because the anarchist movement was brief, especially after Roe v. Wade made it seem strategically wise to rely on government power. The women's movement was to take off in a decisively liberal direction and rely on increasingly organization forms that were anything but egalitarian. But for those still working in egalitarian collectives or trying to create them, feminists have effectively framed the terms of the debate. If you want to keep decisions making into the smallest group possible, how do those groups coordinate? Within those groups, how to prevent a clique of friends from taking over? How to prevent certain categories of participants, straight women's, gay women's, older women's, students in mixed groups, and it soon becomes simple women from being marginalized. What more, even if like mainstream feminists have abandoned the politics of direct action, there are plenty of radical feminists, not to mention an anarcho-feminism, around to try to keep such groups honest. The origins of the current direct action movement goes back to precisely the attempts to resolve these dilemmas. The pieces really started coming together in the anti-nuclear movement of the late 70s. The first was the founding of the Clamshell Alliance and the occupation of the southern Shoreham nuclear power plant in Massachusetts in 1977. Then followed by the Abilene Alliance of struggle over the Diablo Canyon plant in California a few years later. The main inspiration for anti-nuclear activism, at least on questions of organizations, were ideas propounded by a group called the Movement for a New Society, MSN, MNS, based in Philadelphia. MNS was spearheaded by a gay rights activist named George Lankey, who, like several other members of the group, was an anarchist Quaker. I want to learn more about the Quakers, honestly. Or talk to more people who raised Quakers. They seem quite fascinating. I talked to one who was working with the Planned Parenthood task force, actually. That seemed cool. Lakey and his friends proposed a vision of nonviolent revolution. Rather than a catalytic seizure of power, they proposed the continuing creation of elaborate new institutions based on a new, non-alienating form of interactions, institutions that could be considered prefigurative, insofar as they provide a foretaste of what a truly democratic society might be like. Such prefigurative institutions could gradually replace the existing society order, likely in 1973. The vision in itself was hardly new. It was a non-violent version of the standard anarchist idea of building a new world within the shell of the old. What was new was that men like Lankley have been brought up as Quakers and acquired a great deal of experience with Quakers' decision-making process, had a particular vision of how some of these alternatives might actually work. Many of what is now become standard features of former consensus process, the principles that the facilitators should never act as a interest party in the debate. The idea of the bloc was first disseminated by the MNS training in Philadelphia and Boston. The anti-nuclear movement was also the first to make its basic organization unit the affinity group, a kind of minimal unit of organization first developed by anarchists in early 20th century Spain and Latin America and spokes councils. As Starhawk pointed out in Chapter 1, all of this was very much a learning process, a kind of blind experiment, and things were often extremely rocky. At first, organizers were such consensus purists that they insisted that anyone individual had the right to block proposals even on the national level, which proves entirely unworkable. I can see why. Still, direct action proves spectacularly successful in putting the issue of nuclear power on the map. If anything, the movement fell victim to its own success. Though it rarely won a battle, that is, for a blockade to prevent the construction of any particular new plan, it was very quickly won the war. U.S. government plans to build 100 new generators were scotched after a couple of years of new plans to build nuclear plants have been announced since. Attempting to move from nuclear plants to nuclear missiles and from there to a social revolution, however, proved more of a challenge, and the movement itself was never able to jump from the nuclear issue to become the basis of a broader revolutionary campaign. After the early 1980s, it largely disappeared. Consensus is foolish. Supermajorities are better. 2/3, 3/4, 7/8 is close enough to consensus and prevents narrow interests from shutting everyone down. Yeah, I have heard in one of the Rebel Steps podcasts, one of the early ones, I think in the first season, that did cover consensus making process. And there has been like some situations in the DSA decision making process that there have been people that's just like that one guy, the one person that always like blocks things and just like use that frivolously. In the chapter 3, when David Graeber was talking in the diary portion, when David Graeber was talking to a Quaker that was like housing the activists in their plans and for the summit of their protest at the summit of the FTAA in Quebec City, is implied because that everyone has the power to block a proposal, that everyone uses it. They recognize that, and they thus then use it responsibly. At least that's the idea. It seems to work with the Quakers. It probably does actually work with some organizations. But I can see how if someone doesn't use it responsible, we can certainly see kind of like people using their powers irresponsible in like the federal government right now. That's if people can come to the conclusion that the consensus is foolish, and if consensus doesn't prove to be able to get anything passed, then I would agree with like the use of majorities or supermajorities as a word. But even if we're going to a voting process, as much as possible, I would want, for major decisions, especially decisions affecting the community, I would want to get as close to consensus as I can. Works in communities that last a long term, and they rely on each other and are bound together, because being the jerk bites you in the rear in the long run, I think. Yeah, well, exactly, and that's how anarchist argues that, like, oh, actually, my friend Joey, who the indigenous heritage, they are Lakota. They're part of the like indigenous group in the Dakotas, north and south, like around the Black Hills, like Mount Rushmore. They were part of that protest. That's where I think Joe. Hold on, I got knocked on the door, so I'm gonna mute my microphone. Sorry about that. It had a brief like a little meeting with my brothers. I might have to end the stream soon-ish, but I'll try to get through the rest of the pages. I may have to abruptly end it at a certain point though. My brothers originally had planned to go see a movie tonight, but the Washington State issue more stay-at-home orders, so all movie theaters are now closed and the tickets being refunded. But anyway, this is not to say nothing was going in the late 1980s and 1990s. Radical AIDS activists working with ACT UP and with the radical revolutionist groups like Earth First kept these techniques alive and developed them. In the 1990s, there was an effort to create a North American anarchist federations around the newspaper called love and rage, that is at its peaks involve hundreds of activists in different cities. Still, it's probably accurate to see this period less as an era of grand mobilization than as one of the molecules disseminations. A typical example is the story of Food Not Bombs, a group originally found by a few friends from Boston who hadn't been part of an affinity group providing food during the actions of Showhorn. In the early 1980s, veterans of the Affinity Group set up shop in a squandered house in Boston, began dumpster diving fresh produce cast out by supermarkets and restaurants, and providing free vegetarian meals to distribute in public places. After a few years, one of the founding members moved to San Francisco and set up a similar operation there. Word spread in part because some dramatic televised arrests. And by the mid-1990s, autonomous chapters of Food Not Bombs were appearing all over America and Canada as well. Yeah, they're still around. By the turn of the millennium, there was literally hundreds. But Food Not Bombs is not an organization. There's no overarching structure, no membership or annual members. It is just an idea that food should go to those that in need. In a way, those can fit themselves become part of the process if they want. Plus some basic how-to information now easily available on the internet, and a shared community commitment to egalitarian decision-making and a do-it-yourself spirit. Gradually, cooperatives, anarchist info shops, clinics, defense groups, and anarchist Black Cross prisoners collectives, pirate radio collectives, squats, and chapters of anti-racist actions begin springing up on a similar molecular basis across the continent. All became workshops for the creation of direct democracy, but especially since so much of it's developed not on campuses, but within counterculture menus, like in the punk scene, it remains well below the radar, not only the corporate media, but even of the standard progressive journalists like Mother Jones or The Nation. This, in turn, explains how such groups suddenly began to coalesce and coordinate in Seattle. It seemed for the rest of the country as if this movement had suddenly appeared from nowhere. But by the time we get to Seattle, though, it's impossible to even pretend such matters could be discussed within a national framework. What the press insists on calling the anti-globalization movement was from the very beginning a self-consensus conscientious global movement. The actions against the WTO ministerial in Seattle were first proposed by PGA, the People's Global Action, a planetary network that came into being by the initiative of the Zapatista rebels in Giesta. The emphasis on the WTO reflected these concerns of farmer groups in India, and the tactics employed could eventually well be seen as an aggregate of ideas drawn mainly from the global south, then as indigenous America development. It was the internet, above all, that made this possible. If nothing else, the internet has allowed for a quadrilateral leap in the range and speed of molecular dissemination. There are now Food Not Bombs chapters, for instance, in Kaeskas and Bangan. The year or two directly after Seattle also saw the emergence of the networks of independent media centers, radical web journalists that has completely transformed the possibilities of information flow about actions and events. Activists who seemed to struggle for months and years to put on actions that were then entirely ignored by media now is known that anything they will do be picked up and reported instantly. In photos, stories, and videos across the planet, if only in a form accessed largely by other activists. The great problem has been how to translate the flow of information into structures of collective decision-making, since decision-making is one of the things that is almost impossible to do on the internet. Sadly, yes, or more precisely, the question is, when and on what level are structures of collective decision-making is required? The Direct Action Network, the continental dance structure that began to set up in the months following Seattle, was a first attempt to address this problem. Ultimately, it foundered, and in doing so, however, it's always played a key role in disseminating certain models of direct democracy and making their practice pretty much is sacred from the idea of direct action. It is the conjecture of those two phenomena, now pretty much irreversible established in the most radical social movements in America and increasingly elsewhere. That's the real subject of this book. Well, other than that little brief little knock there, I happened to, basically me and my brothers were planning to see a movie tonight, an anime movie actually. Face Day Night's Heaven's Field, the third part of it, and we actually saw the doubleheader of part 1, part 2 last Saturday. But since then, Governor Jay Inslee, who won his re-election, I believe, Washington State, instituted more lockdown measures, especially while he opened the restrictions to allow us to go see the movie last week in the movie theater. He closed restrictions down to stop the spread of COVID-19 and to allow places hospitals to not be filled up again with more cases. So it's getting close to that. The Washington State's hospitals, I think, are getting close at capacity, and people are going to go on Thanksgiving. So my brother my oldest brother just found out that the tickets were canceled and that there's no movie tonight. Essentially, we were planning to see it tonight. Hey, yeah, exactly. I think unfortunately these ebbs and flows are going to happen until we have the vaccine for COVID-19, which are coming. But still, we should wear the mask and practice the social distancing, and as always, and try to get others to also wear the mask too. Or if they have masks on, remember that they should cover their nose. But hey, I managed to finish chapter 5, Direct Action An Ethnography. I've been streaming for 4 hours. Thank you to Nasty Echo. Thank you to Duke of Falls. Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. Say 6 feet apart. For those who don't know not to use the English system, that'll be 2 meters. But now I finished with chapter 5, Direct Action Ethnography. Chapter 6, just wondering what it is. Some notes on activist culture. Oh, that's going to be very interesting. Oh, I'm actually really intrigued about that. I know. So many friends are just huggers. I mean, they're so deprived of human content that they want to do that. But anyway, now that I'm done streaming, okay. So I have a couple targets to rate into. Yeah, in the general sense, yes, yeah, we should all wear a mask in the general sense. But I think even though I probably rated into them last week, but I think I want to rate into a Sarah Britt again, because they're really cool. Streamer, I worked with Sarah Britt on 2 Charity weekends now, so we're going to shout out Sarah Britt. That's who we're going to rate into next. They are playing Dusk, a Eastland Tale. That should be a lot of fun. I've caught one of their streams before as they were playing that. That was awesome. Sarah Britt also took part in a stream that Tabby the Wolf was organized. That was a very, very, very somber one, where they just read out the names of all the trans folks that passed away in the past year in accordance to yesterday's the Trans Day of Remembrance. Well, remember all of the trans people that have fallen, and so Sarah was a part of that yesterday. But now they are having fun playing Dust, a Eternal Tale. So there's a link there. Click that link, right click it, open up the new tab so that the ad will play in that new tab. And so then when we raid into Sarah Britt, and I'll type in the raid command now, then you'll join immediately with Sarah right then and there, as the raid happens. And so thank you to everyone for coming. I will shout out Naz the Neko again just because I love doing so. Oh, and she's a good friend and a good streamer as well. I caught a bit of that stream the other night, actually. Well, I raided into you as well. They were playing Among Us with friends. It was a lot of fun. Thank you, Duke of Volts, for coming. Check out all the panels below as well, like Social Justice Achlemy, which is going to happen like tomorrow. It is now on Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern, where it's just a bunch of anarchists like sit around and like chat about like different things. And I have a YouTube channel, and that YouTube channel is where all the like VODs of like me reading Direct Action and other like essays are going to be put up to like stay there forever. So even if you miss this one, you will get to see the you can still like rewatch them and to like consume more of this like content. Follow me on Twitter, or the social links there, because it's on Twitter. Twitter's the main thing that I will announce like my streams, and that's where you'll like know when I'm going to be streaming next. That's it for everyone. So thank you all for coming. Let's now raid Sarah Britt and have a good time and give her a raid. Just say geeky raid or use whatever raid emotes you want to. Thank you so much for coming. And now let's raid out.